The Viper, ruthless, cunning and feared across all of Ireland, ruled the streets with an iron fist. But behind the terrifying legend was a web of betrayal, secrets and violence that no one could escape. This is the story of how John the Viper Malone's empire of terror began to crumble from within, bringing down Ireland's most notorious psycho-gangster once and for all. Ireland's underworld was forever changed the day a man known only as the Viper rose to power. Born in one of Dublin's poorest neighborhoods, he was a product of hardship and struggle from the very beginning. His early years were marked by violence and deprivation, where survival meant learning to fight both for respect and for life itself. Even as a boy, there was something different about him, a cold, calculating nature that set him apart. While other kids played, he observed, learning the ways of the streets and the people who ruled them. By the time he reached his 20s, the Viper had already carved a reputation for himself that sent chills down the spines of even the most hardened criminals. Unlike many gangsters who relied on brute strength or loud threats, the Viper was subtle and cunning. He was methodical in how he built his empire, starting with small-time crimes like theft and protection rackets, then moving swiftly into more dangerous and profitable ventures like drug trafficking and illegal gambling. His rise was marked by strategic alliances and brutal betrayals, but it was clear to everyone that he was no ordinary criminal. What made the Viper truly terrifying wasn't just his cruelty, but his intelligence. He understood the power of fear and control, using it like a weapon to dominate Dublin's underworld. He created a network of loyal followers who operated like extensions of his own will. These men carried out his orders without question, enforcing his rule with a ruthless efficiency. Stories began to circulate about the lengths he would go to punish those who crossed him, from public beatings to mysterious disappearances. The message was clear: no one was safe if they defied the Viper. The streets themselves seemed to bend under his influence. Businesses paid heavy protection fees, knowing refusal could mean arson or worse. Local communities lived in silent fear, afraid to speak out or seek help. Police forces tried to intervene, but corruption ran deep, and the Viper had ways to stay one step ahead. Witnesses vanished, evidence was destroyed, and those brave enough to testify faced terrifying consequences. His control wasn't just over the criminal world, it seeped into everyday life, casting a shadow over entire neighborhoods. Despite the violence, there was a strange sense of order to his reign. The Viper enforced strict rules within his gang, demanding loyalty and punishing betrayal with swift brutality. He wasn't a reckless man. Every move was calculated to strengthen his grip on power. His empire grew quietly but relentlessly, and as his influence spread beyond Dublin into other parts of Ireland, so did his legend. Newspapers began to report on Ireland's most notorious gangster, but no one knew his real identity, only the chilling nickname the Viper. His rise was not just about accumulating wealth or power, it was about sending a message to the entire country. The Viper was a force of nature, a reminder of what happens when lawlessness goes unchecked. He was a ghost and a nightmare, appearing suddenly and striking without warning. As his empire grew, so did the stories, whispers of his cruelty, his intelligence and the mystery that surrounded him. The Viper was no ordinary criminal. He was something darker, something that haunted Ireland's streets for years to come. The Viper's reign over Ireland's criminal underworld was built not just on violence, but on an empire of fear that spread far beyond the streets of Dublin. His gang operated with a ruthless efficiency that few had ever seen before. Unlike chaotic gangs that relied on random acts of violence, the Viper's organization was structured like a business, cold, calculated, and brutal. He understood that true power came from control, not just force. Every territory his gang claimed was carefully planned and fiercely defended. The Viper's name became synonymous with terror, and his influence grew so deeply that ordinary people lived in constant fear of crossing his path. Local businesses became pawns in his game of control. Shops, pubs, and small companies were forced to pay protection fees, often at extortionate rates. Those who resisted faced harsh consequences: windows smashed, property burned, or worse. The Viper's gang had no qualms about making examples of people who disobeyed, sending a message that resistance was pointless. This constant threat of violence forced entire communities into silence, creating an atmosphere where no one dared to speak out. The Viper's reach extended even into law enforcement. where corruption allowed him to stay several steps ahead of the police. His gang was known for terrifying acts designed to maintain absolute obedience. Stories spread of victims who had been disfigured or tortured as punishment. Some people simply disappeared, never to be seen again. These brutal methods were not just acts of cruelty but strategic tools to keep everyone in line. Fear became the gang's currency, and it flowed freely throughout the city's underbelly. The Viper's reputation for mercilessness was so widespread that even rival gangs hesitated before challenging him. But behind the fear was a strict code. The Viper demanded loyalty above all else. Betrayal was the gravest sin, punishable by death. His lieutenants enforced this with an iron fist, ensuring that no one within the gang stepped out of line. Despite the violence, there was an order to his world, a hierarchy that kept his empire stable and efficient. Each member had a role, and every action was part of a larger plan to expand and protect their territory. This structure allowed the Viper to maintain control over a sprawling criminal network that few could penetrate. The gang's influence wasn't limited to Dublin alone. As the Viper's power grew, so did his ambitions. His operations expanded into other counties, spreading his brand of fear across Ireland. Smuggling routes were established, drug distribution networks flourished, and illegal gambling dens popped up under his protection. His empire grew like a shadow, darkening every corner it touched. Police efforts to dismantle his operations often failed, hampered by corrupt officers and the gang's careful secrecy. Public fear reached a boiling point. Citizens whispered about the Viper in hushed tones, afraid to mention his name aloud. His story became a warning passed from person to person, a reminder of what unchecked power and violence could do to a community. For years it seemed no one could stop him. His iron grip on Ireland's streets was absolute, his gang untouchable. Yet beneath this seemingly invincible surface, cracks were beginning to form. Tensions inside the gang and the growing pressure from law enforcement hinted at an empire that, while terrifying, might not last forever. The Viper's reign of terror was far from over, but the seeds of its downfall had already been planted. Behind the terrifying reputation of the Viper stood a shadowy inner circle, a group of trusted men who helped him run his criminal empire with ruthless precision. These lieutenants were handpicked for their loyalty and skill, acting as extensions of the Viper's will throughout Ireland's underworld. Each had a specific role, from managing drug shipments and overseeing protection rackets to coordinating violence and keeping the gang's secrets safe. Together they formed the backbone of the organization, a tightly knit team that kept the wheels turning smoothly in a world ruled by fear. The inner circle was built on strict rules, loyalty was the highest commandment, and betrayal was met with swift and brutal punishment. The Viper demanded absolute obedience, and those who failed him paid a heavy price. His lieutenants lived with the constant knowledge that one mistake could mean death. This intense pressure created an atmosphere of tension within the group. Beneath the surface of camaraderie, there was suspicion and rivalry. Each member was aware that the others were just as capable and dangerous as they were, and this unspoken competition fueled a fragile balance of power. Despite their fear of the Viper, some of the lieutenants nursed ambitions of their own. They had tasted power and control, and not all were content to remain in the shadows forever. Quietly, some began plotting, testing the limits of their loyalty. These cracks in the gang's foundation were invisible to outsiders but threatening to everything the Viper had built. The man who controlled the streets through fear now faced a new challenge, the threat from within. This inner tension was complicated by the gang's expansion. As the Viper extended his reach into new territories, he relied more heavily on his lieutenants to maintain order far from his immediate presence. Communication became more complicated, and enforcing loyalty across distances proved difficult. Some members began acting independently, making decisions without consulting the Viper or the council. These rogue moves risked attracting unwanted attention and weakening the gang's cohesion. Still, the Viper maintained his grip by rewarding loyalty with power and wealth. The highest-ranking members enjoyed luxurious lifestyles, a sharp contrast to the squalor most of Ireland lived in. This material success kept many loyal, but it also created jealousy and greed. The temptation to betray for a bigger share of the pie was always present. In such an environment, trust was rare and often temporary. Friendships formed and dissolved quickly, and alliances shifted like the tides. The gang's operations were carefully compartmentalized. This secrecy ensured that if one part of the organization was compromised, the rest could survive. But it also meant that few truly understood the full scope of the Viper's empire. Each lieutenant guarded their knowledge jealously, adding another layer of suspicion to the already tense atmosphere. Paranoia grew, making the inner circle a dangerous place where every glance could hide a threat, and every conversation might be a trap. All the while, the Viper watched closely, aware that the greatest danger to his empire was not the police or rival gangs, but the men closest to him. His paranoia grew as he tightened his control, demanding even more loyalty and punishing even minor disobedience. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, one that would change everything. The once solid foundation of the Viper's power was cracking, and no one in the inner circle could predict who would emerge victorious or who would be the first to betray the rest. In this world of shadows, alliances, and secrets, trust was a rare commodity, and survival depended on knowing who to fear most. The inner circle was a web of power struggles, hidden agendas, and dangerous ambitions, a crucible where the Viper's empire would either strengthen or shatter, and as tensions reached a boiling point, Ireland's most notorious gangster faced a threat that would prove far deadlier than any rival, the threat from inside his own ranks. The backbone of the Viper's criminal empire was not only his gang's muscle and fear, but also a secret system that kept everything running smoothly. A hidden ledger, known only to a select few. This ledger was more than just a book of numbers. It was a detailed record of every illegal deal, every secret payment, and every hidden alliance that kept the empire alive. The Viper guarded it fiercely because within those pages lay the true power of his organization. The ledger held accounts that revealed the flow of money from drug shipments to extortion rackets, and it named corrupt officials who received bribes to look the other way. This secret document was the Viper's insurance policy, ensuring loyalty from those who feared exposure as much as they feared his violence. It was a map of the underworld's connections, a list that, if revealed, could bring down not just the Viper's gang but many powerful figures who benefited from his rule. Only a handful of people had access to the ledger: the Viper himself, his closest lieutenants, and trusted accountants who managed the gang's finances. They knew the importance of keeping the ledger safe, understanding that its exposure would spell disaster. Because of this, the ledger was hidden in a secret location, protected by multiple layers of security, locked safes, trusted couriers, and a strict system of codes. The gang operated on the belief that secrecy was their greatest weapon. For years, this system worked perfectly. The Viper's empire grew quietly behind the scenes, shielded from law enforcement by layers of deception and corruption. The ledger helped to keep everyone in check. Members who questioned orders or tried to cheat the gang found themselves threatened, not only by violence but by the threat of being named in the ledger and turned over to the authorities. The ledger was a constant reminder that betrayal would have consequences far worse than death. But despite all these precautions, the ledger was vulnerable. As the Viper's empire expanded, so did the risks of exposure. The more people involved, the harder it became to maintain total secrecy. There were whispers among the gang members that the ledger held secrets some wanted to keep hidden at any cost. Paranoia grew, and the Viper's trust in even his closest allies began to waver. The ledger was no longer just a tool, it had become a dangerous weapon that could destroy the empire from within. Unknown to the Viper, the ledger would soon become the key to his downfall. A betrayal from inside the gang put the ledger directly in the hands of the police. This event shocked everyone. How could something so well guarded be stolen? The answer lay in the growing tensions within the inner circle, where ambition and fear collided. The ledger was no longer a secret but a ticking time bomb that threatened to explode and expose everything. When law enforcement finally got their hands on the ledger, the full scale of the Viper's operations was revealed. The evidence was overwhelming, linking the gang to dozens of crimes and exposing a network of corruption that reached into government and police forces. The ledger became the foundation for a massive crackdown, tearing apart the empire piece by piece. What once seemed invincible now looked fragile, vulnerable to collapse. The ledger's exposure changed everything. It turned allies into enemies and fear into chaos. The Viper's empire, built on secrecy and control, was crumbling, all because of a single book. The story of that ledger remains one of the most shocking secrets uncovered in Ireland's criminal history. a reminder of how the smallest crack in a fortress can bring down the mightiest empire. Betrayal is often the most devastating wound for any criminal empire, and for the Vipers gang it became the spark that ignited their downfall. For years loyalty had been enforced with fear and violence, and trust was a rare commodity. But even the most ruthless leaders cannot control what happens inside their closest circles. One of the Vipers' most trusted men, a lieutenant who had stood by him through countless violent clashes and power struggles, secretly began cooperating with the police. This betrayal wasn't a sudden act born from a moment of weakness, it was a carefully planned move fueled by fear, greed, or perhaps a deeper hidden motive. The betrayal shook the gang to its core. No one expected that a man so close to the Viper could turn his back on everything they had built. This lieutenant had access to the gang's inner workings, including the secret ledger that mapped out every illegal transaction and secret alliance. When he handed over the ledger to law enforcement, it was like handing them the keys to the entire criminal kingdom. Suddenly, years of crime and corruption were exposed in one devastating blow. The police were stunned by the extent of the information. The ledger didn't just reveal the Viper's operations, it uncovered a tangled web of corruption involving politicians, police officers, and businessmen. The depth of the gang's reach was unimaginable, and the betrayal had shattered the illusion of invincibility that had protected the Viper for so long. For the first time, the gang faced the real possibility of total collapse. Within the gang, suspicion and paranoia exploded. Members who had once been loyal began to question everyone around them. Whispers of other potential traitors filled the air. The Viper himself became increasingly isolated, trusting no one. The betrayal had not only cost them valuable information but had also broken the fragile bonds that held the gang together. Fear of being next to betray the group surged in one devastating blow. The police were stunned by the extent of the information. The ledger didn't just reveal the Viper's operations, it uncovered a tangled web of corruption involving politicians, police officers, and businessmen. The depth of the gang's reach was unimaginable, and the betrayal had shattered the illusion of invincibility that had protected the Viper for so long. For the first time, the gang faced the real possibility of total collapse. Within the gang, suspicion and paranoia exploded. Members who had once been loyal began to question everyone around them. Whispers of other potential traitors filled the air. The Viper himself became increasingly isolated, trusting no one. The betrayal had not only cost them valuable information but had also broken the fragile bonds that held the gang together. Fear of being next to betray the group spread like wildfire. The lieutenant who betrayed the Viper faced his own dangers. While cooperating with the police offered some protection, he lived with the constant threat of violent revenge. The gang was notorious for hunting down those who crossed them, and no one believed he would escape unscathed. His decision to turn on the Viper came at a great personal risk, but it was a calculated gamble, one he believed was necessary to survive. This act of treachery marked a turning point. The police used the ledger to launch coordinated raids and arrests that struck at the heart of the gang's operations. Safe houses were discovered, large sums of money seized, and key figures imprisoned. The gang's empire, once seemingly untouchable, began to unravel rapidly. The betrayal had opened a floodgate, and the law enforcement forces took full advantage. The shock waves of the betrayal were felt beyond the gang's ranks. Communities long oppressed by the Viper's rule began to breathe easier, but the damage was far from over. The power vacuum left by the gang's collapse led to new conflicts as rival factions vied for control. The streets that had once belonged to the Viper were plunged into chaos, proving that even the fall of a tyrant can bring a dangerous aftermath. In the end, the betrayal inside the gang was the fatal blow that no amount of violence or intimidation could prevent. It exposed the cracks hidden beneath the surface, and showed how fragile even the most feared criminal empires really are. The Viper's downfall was not just a story of crime and punishment, but a chilling reminder that the greatest threats often come from within. Once the secret ledger fell into the hands of the police, a powerful chain reaction was set in motion that would shake the Viper's empire to its core. Armed with undeniable proof of the gang's illegal activities, law enforcement launched a swift and coordinated crackdown that targeted every corner of the criminal network. What followed was the most aggressive police operation Ireland had seen in decades, aimed at dismantling the sprawling underworld machine the Viper had built with such care and cruelty. The raids were sudden and overwhelming. Early one morning, teams of officers moved in on safe houses, drug labs, and hidden warehouses across Dublin and neighboring counties. The gang, used to operating in the shadows, found themselves exposed and vulnerable. Large amounts of cash, weapons, and narcotics were seized, evidence that linked the gang directly to violent crimes, trafficking, and corruption. The arrests sent shockwaves through the criminal community. Key players who had seemed untouchable were suddenly in handcuffs, facing charges that could mean life behind bars. The pressure on the Viper and his inner circle became unbearable. With trusted lieutenants captured or on the run, the once tightly controlled organization began to unravel. Communication between members broke down, and paranoia grew as everyone wondered who might be next. The gang structure, carefully maintained for years, collapsed under the weight of arrests and betrayals. The empire that had seemed unbreakable was cracking open. For the police, the operation was a hard-fought victory, but it came at a cost. Many officers involved faced threats, intimidation, and even violence from the gang's remaining members. Corruption within the force complicated the investigation, as some officers were found to have been on the Viper's payroll. Rooting out these corrupt elements was essential but slowed the overall progress. Still, the momentum was with the law enforcement agencies, who were determined to end the reign of terror once and for all. Public reaction was intense. Communities that had long suffered under the gang's rule expressed relief and hope, but also fear of what might come next. The gang's downfall created a power vacuum, and rival factions began vying for control. Violence flared in some neighborhoods as smaller gangs attempted to take over the territory left behind. For many, the streets felt less safe, even as the Viper's direct influence faded. The Viper himself became a ghost. With most of his empire dismantled, he disappeared into the shadows, evading capture. His whereabouts remained unknown for months, fueling rumors that he had fled the country or was hiding in remote parts of Ireland. This vanishing act only added to his mystique. The man who had once ruled the streets with an iron fist was now a hunted fugitive, a symbol of a crumbling criminal dynasty. Despite the chaos, the police continued their efforts relentlessly. Using the information from the ledger and ongoing surveillance, they tracked down remaining gang members, gradually tightening the net. The initial crackdown was only the beginning of a long and difficult battle to bring the Viper and his associates to justice. The crackdown exposed not just the criminal activities of the gang, but also the deep corruption that had allowed them to thrive for so long. It was a turning point in Ireland's fight against organized crime, proving that even the most powerful and ruthless gangs could be brought down if law enforcement was determined enough. The fall of the Viper's empire was underway, but the journey to justice was far from over. As the police tightened their grip on the Viper's criminal empire, the streets of Ireland descended into chaos unlike anything seen before. The sudden collapse of such a powerful organization created a dangerous power vacuum that rival gangs eagerly sought to fill. For years, the Viper's gang had maintained control through fear and brutality, suppressing competition and keeping violence at a twisted kind of order. But once that grip loosened, old rivalries ignited, and new factions rose quickly, hungry to claim what was left behind. The turf wars that followed were brutal and unforgiving. Small gangs clashed violently in neighborhoods that had once been under the Viper's iron rule. Shootings, beatings, and intimidation became daily occurrences. Innocent bystanders found themselves caught in the crossfire as the struggle for dominance tore communities apart. For many residents, the fall of the Viper's gang did not bring peace but a new era of instability and fear. The streets they thought might finally be safe became battlegrounds for control. These rival gangs operated with different styles and ambitions. Some sought to replicate the Viper's methods of control through fear and corruption, while others preferred chaotic violence, making no promises of order. This mix made the situation even more unpredictable and dangerous. Police found themselves overwhelmed, trying to contain the violence while continuing their pursuit of the Viper and the remnants of his organization. Amidst this chaos, smaller groups began forming alliances, attempting to consolidate power. Some former members of the Viper's gang defected to these new factions, bringing with them knowledge, resources, and a willingness to fight. The struggle for control was not just about territory, but about surviving in a world turned upside down. These alliances were fragile, often breaking apart as quickly as they formed, leading to shifting loyalties and new betrayals. The rise of these new criminal groups also brought fresh challenges for law enforcement. The decentralized nature of these gangs made them harder to track and dismantle. Unlike the Viper's tightly organized empire, these factions operated in smaller, more mobile units, making raids and arrests more difficult. The police had to adapt their tactics, focusing on intelligence gathering and undercover operations to keep pace with the changing landscape. For the communities caught in the middle, the consequences were devastating. Local businesses suffered as extortion demands and violence increased. Many residents felt abandoned, frustrated by the slow pace of justice and overwhelmed by the new dangers surrounding them. Community leaders and activists began calling for greater support and reforms, hoping to break the cycle of crime and violence that had gripped their neighborhoods for so long. Amidst the violence and chaos, the Viper's name still carried weight. His legacy was a reminder of a dark era that had shaped the criminal world and the lives of countless people. Even as new gangs fought for control, the memory of his ruthless rule lingered, casting a long shadow over Ireland's streets. The fall of the Viper did not bring an immediate end to crime but instead marked the beginning of a dangerous and uncertain transition. Rival factions battled for supremacy, communities struggled to survive, and law enforcement faced new and complex threats. The story of the Viper's empire was far from over. It had merely entered a new and violent chapter, one that would test the resilience of Ireland's people and the strength of its justice system. As the violent turf wars raged and new gangs scrambled for control, the Viper himself remained a ghost, a figure both feared and hunted, yet seemingly impossible to capture. His disappearance added a new layer of mystery and tension to the already chaotic underworld. For months, law enforcement chased shadows and rumors, piecing together fragments of information about his whereabouts, but he always stayed one step ahead. His vanishing act became almost legendary, fueling speculation and fear in equal measure. The Viper's ability to evade capture was not just luck. It was the result of years of experience in the criminal world and an extensive network of loyal supporters who helped hide him. Despite the chaos his empire was facing, he still commanded respect and fear among those who remained loyal. His name alone could silence entire rooms, and whispers of his return sparked unease among rival gangs who feared what his comeback might mean. Behind the scenes, the Viper was far from inactive. He was quietly rebuilding, using contacts in the shadows and trusted associates who had managed to avoid arrest. His disappearance was a calculated move, a chance to regroup, rethink, and come back stronger. He knew that the violent battles raging across the streets would eventually wear down his enemies, leaving openings for his return. The Viper was patient, playing the long game with the cold precision that had made him so dangerous. At the same time, law enforcement intensified their efforts. The search for the Viper became a top priority, with multiple agencies collaborating to track down leads. They increased surveillance, monitored known associates, and followed financial trails hoping to uncover the man behind the legend. The pressure was immense, but so was the challenge. The Viper was a master of disguise and misdirection, making it nearly impossible to pin him down. The public's fascination with the Viper grew during this time. Media outlets ran stories about the elusive gangster, dissecting his past crimes and speculating on his next moves. He became a symbol of Ireland's battle against organized crime, a figure who represented both fear and the lawlessness that gripped the streets. This attention only added to the tension, as the Viper's name carried weight far beyond the criminal world. While some saw him as a villain who needed to be stopped, others were drawn to his story, a mix of brutal power and cunning intelligence. His disappearance became part of his legend, transforming him into a mysterious anti-hero in the eyes of some. But for the families affected by his crimes and the communities left shattered, the Viper was a reminder of violence and pain that would not easily fade. As months turned into years, the chase continued. The Viper's empire had fallen, but the man himself remained elusive. His survival depended on secrecy and silence, but also on his ability to adapt and manipulate those around him. The story of Ireland's most notorious gangster was far from over. The man who had once ruled the streets with terror was still out there watching, waiting, and planning his next move. The question remained, would the law catch him before he could strike again, or would the Viper's shadow continue to haunt Ireland's streets for years to come? As the police intensified their hunt for the Viper, cracks began to appear not only in the gang's structure, but also within the law enforcement agencies tasked with bringing him down. Corruption had long been a hidden part of Ireland's battle against organized crime, but the exposure of the Viper's empire brought it into harsh focus. Investigations revealed that some officers had been on the Viper's payroll, providing him with inside information and protecting his operations from prosecution. This betrayal from within made the pursuit more complex and dangerous. The corrupt officers operated like a shadow network, leaking sensitive details about raids, surveillance, and informants. This insider knowledge allowed the Viper and his associates to stay ahead of the law, evade capture, and continue their criminal activities despite increasing police pressure. These compromised officers undermined public trust in law enforcement and complicated efforts to dismantle the gang's remaining influence. The uncovering of corruption led to internal investigations and a crackdown within the police force itself. Officers involved were arrested and charged, but the damage they caused lingered. The scandal shook the foundations of the justice system, raising difficult questions about accountability and oversight. For many, it became clear that defeating a criminal empire as vast as the Viper's required not just aggressive policing but a complete cleansing of corrupted elements within law enforcement. This internal struggle slowed down the investigation and gave the Viper precious time to remain hidden. His network of corrupt contacts was crucial to his survival, providing him with protection and resources even as the gang crumbled around him. The line between criminal and law enforcer blurred, creating a dangerous game of cat and mouse. Those dedicated to justice faced constant threats, making their work perilous and fraught with uncertainty. Despite these obstacles, honest officers and prosecutors remained determined to bring the Viper to justice. They relied heavily on the information from the secret ledger, the testimonies of defectors, and new intelligence gathered through surveillance and undercover operations. These efforts gradually isolated the Viper, cutting off his access to safe havens and financial support. The corruption scandal also sparked public outrage. Citizens demanded transparency and reform, pushing politicians and law enforcement leaders to take decisive action. The scandal became a catalyst for broader changes in how police operations were conducted and monitored. Anti-corruption units were strengthened, oversight committees were formed, and whistleblower protections were enhanced. The fight against organized crime became inseparable from the fight against corruption. Meanwhile, the Viper's ability to manipulate those around him started to wane. Without the safety net of inside help, his movements became riskier and more desperate. The pressure from law enforcement tightened, forcing him further into hiding. His once vast network of influence diminished as allies turned against him or were arrested.